أهلا وسهلا بالجميع. Welcome to Psychic Militancy, and this is a special episode with my friends Saree, Karim, and Ussama. You might know them from MakdisiStreet. We are going to be releasing this on both of our shows. Before we start, make sure you subscribe to both the shows. I know I do for the MakdisiStreet show. There's always excellent content, so make sure you do that. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, share it with a comrade, share it with folks. This is what allows us to continue making content. Let me give you a little bit of a background about how this episode came to be. I'm very excited to be speaking with these three folks, all three of whom I learned so much from and have relationships with, and happen to also share a homeland with me from Lebanon. So I wanted us to come together, especially right now with everything happening in our region, with the Zionist entity sort of raging against everywhere in the region, but certainly Lebanon, Palestine, Iran. And for us to kind of sit down and have a conversation, locate ourselves in Lebanon, and just see how we're doing and just kind of have a communal gathering across our podcast. So ahla wa sahla fikum. Thank you so much for doing this with me, for agreeing. All of us are so busy and we miraculously found this time. So I'm on the road. That's why my backdrop is different, but I couldn't pass up this opportunity to make this happen. So just wanted to start it off with saying, how are you all doing? Karim, you're in Lebanon, but I feel like I can speak for all. Like my heart's in Lebanon. It's always this experience of like living somewhere else and your body's somewhere, but your heart's somewhere else. So maybe we can just start off, all of us, by checking in and seeing where we're at, how we're feeling. I know I'm the shrink in the room. I've already started.
I think you have the key role here, Lara. Thank you for getting us together, but I think you have the key role to keep us sane and maybe to give us advice. At least I would be very welcome to any advice that you might want to give, not
Actually,
just sort
Lara,
of in political
there's
terms.
a guy in the White
personal.
House who could use your advice too. I think if you're
Listen, ideology is not curable. It needs to be dismantled. That's my position.
Yeah, but I mean, speaking from at least from my end, I'm in Beirut. I think I mean, as ever in Lebanon, it sort of really depends where you are in terms of your location. I live here not far, in the Hamra part, not far from the American University of Beirut, in this area near the Mediterranean, and there's a lot of displaced that are here. So you can see a lot of things. You hear the explosions on a very regular basis. The drones are always flying overhead. It's this kind of constant noise, like a very nasty mosquito, which is sort of sitting right on top of you and just won't leave you alone. The planes, the Israeli warplanes have been increasing their presence very clearly. Easter Sunday was a very kind of a big day in terms of the planes flying overhead and hitting several targets, within not so far from this area. Beirut in the end, there's a lot of traffic, but it's a fairly small city in terms of distances. There's an atmosphere which is I think a bit schizophrenic. That Lara, you can teach us again more about what that means. But it just feels that on the one hand, there's a sense of dread. There's a sense of that there's this literal surveillance over you all the time, and that they can literally drop a bomb on you at any given moment. And so there's a kind of helplessness there, where really you're just sort of sitting along, and maybe they're not interested in me at this moment, but if they somehow decided to be interested in me, in 2 seconds I'm gone. And that's imagine if you're part of a community that is actually directly targeted. All the displaced that are in and around us, let alone people in the south or the Bekaa or in the Dahi in Beirut. So there's this on the one hand. The other hand, there's the sense of you're fighting a much bigger fight. You're fighting, at least from my perspective, you're fighting a much bigger fight. You're fighting not just a kind of local situation, a local war. You're fighting in a regional war. You're fighting, frankly, in a global war. I mean, this is a very old war. It feels like that is coming to its climax now, or at least it feels at this point, it feels like it's coming to its climax. And however this ends, there'll be something very new. And there's the internet. But there'll be something very new that comes out of this in one form or the other. I'm not sure if my internet has disappeared there.
No, it wouldn't be Lebanon without internet issues. So ya hala fiik.
Cut and came back.
I'm glad. Yeah,
Yeah.
we can hear you.
Can you hear me now? It's okay?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Yeah. Anyway, I think that's my...
Yeah.
I'm not sure where I connected, but go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to say, it's like, there's this promise of reconfiguring the so-called Middle East for at least, 25 plus years. And it's like, okay, on my end, I'm like, you have all been actually actively doing this. Empire has been meddling actively to do this. And I think what's different is that now there's also a counterforce that's saying you want to reconfigure the Middle East. Okay, we have a say in this as well. So I've, with the resistance across the board saying this is not a unilateral decision on your part about what that reconfiguration looks like. And I think we see uprisings and sort of counter pressures as well. So that's what I'm holding on to, without also letting go of all the daily violences that you see, like forcibly displaced people, the ethnic cleansing in Lebanon. 20% of a population being forcibly displaced is the definition of ethnic cleansing and genocide. So it's not to not look at that, but it's also to say there's a way in which people across our region are also saying you don't get to just decide what this looks like, but you're right in as much also as we don't know what's happening. That's the conversation I have with my parents every day of like, who knows what's going to happen tomorrow. And I think that's a reality. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're dealing with we are in completely uncharted waters in all kinds of ways, in the sense that clearly the most powerful person in the world is clearly off his rocker. I mean, that's not just me as a political thing. I mean, everybody, even people who are typically would be aligned with him politically, are saying the same thing. This is a man who's deeply, deeply, deeply psychotic and off, just completely gone, basically mentally. I don't think he was ever a very smart individual, but he's not just stupid and ignorant. He's malignantly, dangerous, and with all due respect to Alzheimer's patients, I mean, it's like there's clearly something, also some kind of geriatric thing as well as everything else. I mean, it's like a cocktail, and like normally people with a condition like that are taken care of, they're comfortable, their family taken care of them, and so forth. They're not in charge of the entire fate of humanity, which is basically what he is. Now, as we're recording today on Tuesday, we all woke up, at least over here, we woke up with the news that he said an entire civilization will end tonight, and never to come back. Like, who knows what that means? It could mean, I mean, it could mean all kinds of things. It could mean nuclear weapons. It could mean non-nuclear devastation, which the US is also perfectly capable of doing, inflicting. It could be attacks on cities, which they're already doing, but like even bigger attacks. It could be Moabs. It could be anything. It could also just be Trump, the arch bullshitter to the world, bullshitting. I mean, it could be anything in that whole spectrum. And the idea that we're all held hostage by somebody who's mentally off his rocker. I'm sorry not to use more, clinical terms, but it's just something, then of course, then you add the political dimension to it too. And I've noticed this in recent days, that the talk about hitting power plants and bridges and so forth. Okay, let's be clear, the US, obviously, in all of these years of war, going all the way at least back to Vietnam, if not before that, Korea too. Of course, the US has bombed civilian targets, including infrastructure. But more recently, especially Iraq, Afghanistan, it doesn't boast that that's what it's trying to do. And I wouldn't be surprised, honestly, if rules of engagement more or less could, at least traditionally, used to somewhat put limits on what Americans would do in terms of hitting targets. Yes, they would kill civilians, but I don't think they would deliberately go out to destroy civilian infrastructure in the way that, for example, the Israelis have done and do and continue to do. And so I think, and then the talk about the Stone Age or animals, that Trump is sputtering, well, that we know exactly where that language comes from. Speaking of psychotic language, that's Israeli language. That's not something Americans typically say or pronounce, at least not in the 21st century. Again, this is not to excuse American violence or the destruction that the U.S. has wrought across the planet for the past 75, 80 years or whatever it is, and of course before that too in the Western Hemisphere and the Philippines and so on. But I don't know, there's something, seeing this Israelification of American discourse and American policy is very disturbing. And this is something, Lara, if you follow our show, this is a discussion that the three of us have all the time as to who's in charge here. To my mind, first of all, I don't think, like with somebody like Trump, how can, you're the clinician, not us, but I don't know how anybody could speak about anybody actually technically being in charge given his mental state. But insofar as anybody's in charge, as far as I could tell, the Israelis basically have effectively unlimited weapons in terms of aircraft and bombs. And they've been given this essentially unlimited pipeline from the U.S. And we know what the mechanisms are for the Israelis to extract that level of support from the U.S. They literally, last time I checked, I think 435 congresspeople in the House of Representatives in the U.S., 417 have received funding from AIPAC or Zionist sources. So it's not really that complicated to figure out how this works, right? Trump is surrounded by people who are, like the British. There's that British guy in that newspaper article in The Guardian and other places a few weeks ago who said that the British regarded Kushner and Witkoff as essentially Israeli assets. That's not me. That's the British guy saying that. And so here we are with this intense Israelification of American discourse. And as far as I can tell, the only people who benefit, at least in the short run, are the Israelis. This does not help America. This is deeply alienating the U.S. from the entire rest of the world. It's hurting America's Arab friendships and Arab relationships and so forth. It's obviously it's hurting Iran, materially. It's hurting people in Lebanon materially. The only ones who benefit from the destruction of everybody around them are the Israelis, and that's what we're witnessing right now. And yeah, I don't know, Ussama, what do you think? And then,
I share everyone's sort of sense of anger, frustration, despair, rage, despondency, and helplessness at what we're witnessing. Not just to the people we care about and love and our families back home, but also just the sense of what is unfolding before our eyes with these sort of you can't call them deranged tweets or whatever they are, the truth socials. It's just these declarations, these genocidal declarations that he's so cavalier about. So that's one thing. The thing that really also bothers me, quite frankly, is the fact that in the Middle East, in the Arab world, in Lebanon in particular, Laura, since we talked about Lebanon, there's a whole other sort of group of people, and in the Gulf states, who are completely and utterly and totally beholden to the U.S.-Israeli project. They have completely thrown the towel in, and it's extraordinary to see how it's not about whether you support or don't support resistance, etc. Do you have criticisms of Hezbollah, etc.? Those are all, great and fantastic to have these discussions and important to have these discussions. But the idea of people who even now still think, after everything we've seen in Gaza, after everything we've seen in Palestine, in the West Bank, and now in Lebanon, and now with Iran, people still say, oh, this is actually the side we have to stand with. And there's something very chilling about this, and sort of the Arab Zionism, so to speak, or the Muslim Zionism and Arab Zionism. That is what I find very, very, very difficult to comprehend and to process. Really, that's where I am right now.
Yeah. I think you used the word chilling, and it is. But I think just to sort of tie in everything you all were saying, like this has been a long-term project, whether we call it the Israelification of the United States or genocidal warfare, or what is able to be done with impunity, with no pretense anymore. That has been a long-term project of the settler colonial imperial machine of the United States with its proxy that's now seems to be functioning at the same level. Like there is, that there isn't even in a hierarchy anymore. But I suppose that if we think about that as a long-term project, including, by the way, all the money to be made from it. Like I've been tracking all these stories that come out about Trump's, son-in-law investing in oil before they start doing this. I mean, to think about this as the capital machine it is, right? The United States being an arms dealer and a Ponzi scheme first and foremost, and then this is what it's about. And so as I see him melting down, and this is a clinical piece, I'm always also thinking about the displacement. Like this is somebody who is all about making a buck, and I always wonder, what is it that actually set you off from a capital accumulation standpoint that basically made you go off? Because we know they're sociopaths. They don't care about destruction. They don't care about killing people. That's not, if they can get kills and reconfigure things and make massive destructive sort of interventions, that's fantastic. But I do think there's something about capital accumulation. And we hear this, by the way, this genocidal talk also in relation to Cuba, in relation to Venezuela. Like this is just across the board in terms of its ever expansionist project. But if that's been a long-term project, the long-term project has also been about targeting the psyche and the minds and the affect of people in the Arab world. We know this is not a conspiracy. We know there's been a decades-long propaganda campaign across the Arab region to make it such that what you're saying, Ussama, happens, that it becomes seamless, that people just kind of wake up and can't see who the actual aggressor is, despite the fact that it's in front of their eyes, despite the fact that we can track.
Yeah, Lara, I agree with you. But the thing is, what you're talking about is a campaign that was waged really after 1967. In fact, I teach this. Like, there's a document that the State Department sort of released in 69. It's a memorandum about how you have to de-Arabize the Arabs, basically. It's an incredible sort of like piece that Matt Jacobs in his book Imagining the Middle East, I think it's called, refers to, and everyone should take a look at this book and the document in the book. But quite frankly, what's astonishing is that's the US at its peak, not the US now. What I'm trying to understand is, how do people still think that the United States of today, with someone like Donald Trump, with these extraordinary sort of things that he says, how do people think that this is the same US as the 1950s or 60s or 70s? That's what I'm trying to understand. Maybe you can explain psychologically or where people are. Because it's one thing to say, I believe in the stable empire that actually is going to produce a stability, and we're going to benefit from the stability and the Pax Americana, etc. Another thing to support this kind of policy. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
No. Yeah, I don't think you're wrong. I think they've done a vicious job setting up who to hate more. I don't think it's about even benefiting anymore. We do hear this, of course, from folks about, ahsanna, to have somebody else come in. We know that, but I do think the psychic work has been about also disidentifying from people who are around you. It's an issue of who we identify with and who we don't. And white supremacy is a part of that, right? And I think, anti-Shia racism, all of that plays into it, psychologically, affectively, everything we're seeing, so that people, again, can even in fantasy think that what's to come. They might not even know what's coming, by the way. I think all of us are in agreement that nobody knows what's coming, but they're still made to identify with that not knowing in more ways than with what Karim was saying, with the forcibly displaced people right down the street from them. But I think it's terrifying. All of us, that's part of what we're saying. Part of what's so heartbreaking is that that's a reality. Saree, I think you want to.
Yeah, but actually, Lara, again, you're the one who knows more about the psychic stuff than we do, or psychological stuff than we do. But I think that, for example, if we talk about the people that Ussama was referring to a minute ago, the sort of self-hating Lebanese or self-hating Arabs, that's what I would, using elementary language, that's what I would call them. I think it's interesting because you're talking about identification and affiliation in a way. If you look at Druze Palestinians inside the state, inside pre-67 or whatever, 1948 Palestine, basically occupied Palestine, and you look at how, they serve in the Israeli army, and many of them serve in some of the most horrific units in the Israeli army specifically. And I remember when early on during the Gaza genocide, like maybe October, I think it was October 2023, like at the beginning of it really, you know, when, what's his name, their hideous defense minister was saying they're human animals and so forth. So somebody was compiling clips of all of these genocidal pronouncements by Netanyahu and all of his, you know, all the predictable people. And one of the clips was the guy saying, "You're not going to have water. You're not going to be able to breathe. You're going to be smashed into pieces." And I originally saw all this in English, meaning like somebody translated it from what I thought was Hebrew into English. But it turns out the most blood-curdling statement of all, at least to my mind, came from a guy called Ghassan Aliyah, I think is his name. I'm sorry if it's not his name. But he was obviously a Dirzi general in the Israeli army. And this is somebody, and he was talking in Arabic, in Palestinian Arabic, because of course he's actually Palestinian, to fellow Palestinians. But of course he's talking from the standpoint of also wanting to identify himself as an Israeli. So there you have very clearly, and the Israeli state is not in the history of colonialism. Colonial states always have racial hierarchies. I mean, very explicit racial. And the Israeli state is like, it's the best example with all of these rungs on the racial ladder. And everybody at each rung of the ladder is like kicking down the people below them to assert their proximity to those above. It's incredible. You know, the Yemeni, the Arab, the Jewish Arabs, the Arab Jews, the Ethiopian Jews and so forth. Then of course at the bottom of all that there's the Druze, and then there's the Bedouin Palestinians. I think there's a whole series of these things. But the difference is between that kind of affiliation of a Dirzi in occupied Palestine who's working with the Israelis is that he's actually affiliating to a state I think it's mistaken, but he's affiliating to a state project. The self-hating Lebanese who says, you know, we have to make a deal with the Israelis and so forth, and they are too powerful for us. That's a different thing than identification. So in other words, I don't think, like, in other words, somebody inside Palestine who's thinking that way, that is a form of affiliating with white nationalism or white supremacism, which is what Zionism is, because it's like, I want to please those above me in the racial hierarchy and kick down at those below me in the racial hierarchy. In Lebanon, there isn't exactly a racial hierarchy, at least not like that. It's not a colonial racial hierarchy. So I don't know, I think it seems like we need a different language. Ussama uses the term Arab Zionism to refer to them, or let's say the Saudis or the Emiratis who think along similar lines. Still don't think to be a Zionist is to affiliate yourself with a political program. And I don't think people in Lebanon or the Khalij actually are affiliated with. So I think that they bow down to it.
Maybe it's a different, maybe the term, okay.
No, but it's,
maybe
sorry,
the term
just one last thing, I think it is actually worth unpacking these different psychological states of compromise, of self-abasement, of self-hatred, of whatever, as opposed to affiliation, because I think they function differently.
Yeah, but I think also, I mean, Lara, jump in here whenever you want. It's three Makdisi brothers. You have to jump in and you have to be able to say something. But I think self-hatred is too easy a term to use, in the sense that it's, I don't know, when the anti-Shia racism in Lebanon, is that self-hatred? I don't know, that's sectarian hatred, that's dismissal, that's hatred, that's despising. There's a whole thing, there's scapegoating, there's a million different terms we could use. But self-hatred is too easy.
It's also class-related. It's also class-related.
Sorry, Karim?
It's class-related as well. Yeah, they're not referring to upper class Shia. They're referring to lower class from the country.
But there's also all these phrases that we've heard since the Iraq invasion, if not before. You know, the Shia are invading Lebanon, they're invading Beirut, they're coming into Beirut, etc. All that stuff. That language is so like hateful and so filled with privilege and entitlement. I don't know if that's self-hatred, Sadie. I don't know, it's something else. There's something else going on.
Yeah, I think you can add to that. I think there's a class dimension. It's not just sectarian. I think there's a class dimension to it. But I also think now in this period, so the displaced thing, you can look at it in a certain way and say it's just, you know, hatred and things like that. But there's also, I mean, one has to acknowledge that there is a very clear securitization that's taking place. I mean, it is not totally irrational and unreasonable at a certain level to say, if the Israelis tell you, and if you know that if there are certain kinds of people that come to your building, then and they can get targeted and your family will get killed. So you don't need to hate these people, these displaced. to just be scared of your own situation and fearful that you'll go from a kind of passive, you feel, I mean, that's part of this whole process, is they want to make everybody feel, forget the ideologues and the kind of the ones that genuinely hate, etc. But there's a whole group in between that I've been trying to talk about on this pod, which is not hateful in that sense, and it's perfectly fine to live in some form of coexistence with the other. I don't think there's that particular kind of sectarian problem. It's a question of, I'm now terrified that these guys are coming into my areas. The Israelis have said that they will kill anybody, and they have no problem killing anybody that protects them. And I want to protect my neighborhood and stop these people from coming in. So there's a kind of perverse, Lara, you can explain it better in psychological terms, but just in terms of raw feeling, I think there is something outside of either self-hatred or just like being hateful of another group. I think this is what the Israelis are playing on, and this trying to divide people up includes a securitization layer now, which is different as far as I can feel and tell here. It is different than previous iterations where there have been displaced that have come up, even last year, or the 24, 25 when they were coming. It's different, and certainly before that, in every single Israeli attack, there's been a wave of, not quite like this, but there's been successive waves of displaced. And there hasn't been that particular feeling of sectarianization or that feeling of fear, of securitization and fear. And that's part of it is because there is a conviction among some that this is not going to be a temporary position. Like 2006, there's a war, and the second that war ended, people went back. Now there's increasingly the conviction that these are going to be permanently displaced, and there is no going back. And so you're setting up for a kind of more permanent condition in a much, much more difficult overall post-2019 social economic collapse, whereas it is, people are feeling they're on edge and they don't have money, and it's kind of, feeling already barricaded, the state is absent, and there's not much hope. Frankly, if you're in Lebanon, before this war, and well before this war, for the past several years, there's really, we're teaching students, there's very little hope, to be honest. There's very little sense of where can you get a job, where, what do you do, there's really not very much hope in this country. And so this kind of adds, I think, to that layer. What do you think, Laura? What do you think of that?
Yeah, no, what you all are laying out is that there are multiple tracks that are being animated at the same time, right? And they have to do that across the board. They have to animate every track they have available to make the full incursion happen, because they can do it by firepower and air power and all those sorts of things. But you need to reconfigure what it looks like on the inside, and that's their way in. Counterinsurgency manuals, by the way, by the US military, specifically lay this out, what you're saying, Karim. Those people that are targeted, the sort of in between that actually, are fine living with quote unquote the other, those are the biggest prize for them. It's the biggest prize to have people then internally discipline each other, get alienated from each other, dismember each other. And we know, by the way, that part of it is you have the structure do the work for itself because people are afraid for their lives. But we also know the tactics. That's what I mean about multiple tracks being activated at the same time, is that there are text messaging people. They are targeting people who have opened up their homes to displaced folks, text messaging them. They did that in our mountains. In Lebanon, in Falugha and Hamena and all that. They did that the last time around, where people would get text messages directly to their phone saying, we know you have people, kick them out, or we're going to target your home. So on the one level, it's crude counterinsurgency operations. On the other hand, they have this level of access that of course is helped by the United States. You're not getting that level of access and that level of surveillance without US sort of interventionism. But on to the larger question of what Saree was saying, trust me, I have a bone to pick with the Druze. As a Driziyya, the Druze of Palestine are number one on my list to poke with. And I agree with you that there's a larger state project. The thing in Lebanon for me is I'm always thinking about the social and cultural narratives that are told that themselves become things people cohere around, right? And there is an issue of supremacy here that we have to contend with. And I think that's the thing that worries me the most about Lebanon, about how that becomes the cohering principle. It might not be a state project like the Druze in Palestine are sort of seduced into or invited into, But there is a supremacist narrative that has existed for a very long time about the position of Lebanon that Lebanon holds in the so-called Middle East. And I feel psychologically that that's what people are coherent identifying, even if they can't feel it. As an antidote, Karim, to what you're saying about the hopelessness, that's why it's so scary and why we need to intervene and not have people despair. Because when there is despair, that sort of open narrative about if only all of this, I mean, we see a version of this portable logic in the context of the United States against migrants and immigrants, right? It's the same logic that is underpinned by a supremacist logic of if only this were gone, then we could sort of return to our rightful state as these supremacist beings, that this magical place, whatever, fill in the blanks about every Eurocentric sort of, Orientalist narrative about what Lebanon is in reference to the quote unquote West. That's another track that's being completely mobilized, and the parallel, we could be at brunch or whatever version of this. That's what's fascinating to me, how these things are imported and exported across these different areas and does the same psychological effect. But for that to happen psychologically, the infrastructure has to be there. And I think this is part of what we've been contending with across our lifetimes, is how do you sort of intervene at that level, at that level of discourse, at that level of cultural and social reproduction and reproduction, right? But I think that's the real question upon us, because we're all kind of getting to the same place about it. But I don't know what you all are thinking in relationship to that, the question of supremacy.
Karim, do you want to say something about supremacy since you're in Lebanon?
I was trying to follow, but I got disconnected there. So, Lara, do you mind just kind of just summarizing that last point? Sorry, I got disconnected. Or guys, one of you jump in.
It's if somebody else.
Go ahead. I would
Yeah.
say, the project of, there's a sense of the production of a sense of inferiority. So when we see those Lebanese personalities on Twitter, still saying, "Oh, this is all because Iran is doing this stuff against us and so forth," and this is all Iran is like there's obviously part of what's going on there is a sense of I don't know, whatever the proper term is, sense of self-inferiorization, right? Debasement in front of.
That's not us, as we say.
Yeah, okay, fine. Exactly. Right? There's this sense of inferiority as compared to the supremacist power. But also, as Karim was saying, there's also an attempt to assert superiority to. So it's almost like so as I said, in occupied Palestine, the state activates a racial hierarchy because that is in the nature of any racial colonial state, which is what the apartheid state is. But that's all classic. Nothing original about it. There's 200 or 300 years of this kind of thing across the world. But in Lebanon, we don't have a racial state like that. So part of what we're seeing here is not just the divide and rule, which you all were talking about before. I remember also during 2023, I think it was, maybe 24 or 20, I can't remember. At some point in the previous round of this stuff, not that the Israelis have ever stopped bombing Lebanon, but you know what I mean, like in the previous heavy round of it, they bombed somewhere, I think, like way up, like in like Ihden or something like that, like way north. And it was a Christian family that had taken in a Shia family from the south and was sheltering. The Israelis bombed that house. Like they went. There's a level to Israel's malice that's sort of that's we could talk about their psychotic state later. But in terms of this thing, I think it goes back to what Karim was saying also about a sense of superiority over the Shia. There's the fact that there's a Shia axis here, I think, is what helps motivate some of the self-loathing in Lebanese, specifically Lebanese society against the Shia. It's class-based, it's country versus city, and then there's this thing about we don't want Iran, but of course, to complete the sentence for them, they don't want Iran to dominate Lebanon, but they seem to have no problem with Israel dominating Lebanon, which is, of course...
Yeah, or the United States, at that matter. You care about sovereignty now?
Exactly. There's this... Yeah, exactly. So Karim, since you're there and you're in... I mean, I just see these people on Twitter, and, you know, I try to avoid them like the plague if I can. But since, Karim, you actually live cheek by jowl with some of them, so maybe you could tell us more about this mindset of, you know... I think it still is. It fundamentally comes down to a form of self-loathing, because you should be able to identify who your people are and not fall for the bait of divide and rule, which of course the Israelis are trying to play, trying to play on us.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling is there's a lot more complexity to this. I mean, I don't know if it's a question of just self-loathing or self-hating or purely a question of inferiority or not kind of thing. I think it's multiple things. I think there is, sort of generally speaking, there is a class dimension to this. So, you know, when people talk about Shia, they don't mean the upper class kind of person. They mean, you know, a particular sort of image that we can all conjure up. And they look like the people that are displaced, that are sitting in their tents on the Corniche and places like that. That's generally speaking, when people are talking in this context, this is what they mean. They're also, as I said, a kind of a securitized group as a collective. And that's part of the impact. And Lara, you mentioned that. I mean, it's part of this. As an entire group, they've become securitized. I mean, imagine if you're in Palestine and, you know, Gaza opens up a little bit, but the Israelis tell you anybody that goes to Ramallah that is from Gaza, you know, you will be targeted. And, you know, then you can imagine that, you know, it's not sectarian, but you can imagine that some people will be like, oh, I don't want anybody from Gaza to be sitting in my building or my house, because they will and they have attacked. So there is a kind of securitization that is successful there. I think I think one should say that there is a lot of people pushing back against that. And often those people will appear in two ways. Either on some usually Western media report, some kind of feel-good story about some Christian or other that's kind of, you know, that's hosting displaced, and they kind of do a nice feel-good story about it. And it is a feel-good story. I mean, that's the reality, but that's how it gets amplified a little bit in the internationally. Or it's not really brought up otherwise, you know. Although I would say that the vast majority of displaced have been treated with respect, and, you know, you can go to various Christian and Sunni, you know, areas, and Druze areas, of course, where the displacement has, you know, where the people have received support in one form or the other. It's, you know, I keep trying to think. I mean, this may sound stupid, but I mean, in my mind, every time I think about it, I think of Hurricane Katrina. I think, Saree, what was the guy? What's his name? Rodney. What's his name? The guy from LA when there were those riots. You know, if there's
Rodney
a kind
King,
of
can we all get along?
Can we all get along? Rodney King. That was in the 90s, right? This thing of, imagine if you have a quarter of the population. That's America's what, 400 million or something like this. I mean, imagine you have 60, 70, 80, 100 million Americans of a particular kind and a particular class, and coming from some inner cities, picking up and going to other areas. What would happen? I mean, what would happen in the context of America or Germany or these kinds of places where there's this mass displacement? And we it's almost here, I think we take it for granted because there's been Palestinian refugees. We had, you know, 1.5 million Syrian refugees for the longest time, and many of them are still here. Of course, nobody talks about Syrian refugees anymore. Magically, they've disappeared as though they don't exist anymore, and they do exist. Most of them have not returned to Syria. So you have this situation where this country has, over these years, kind of dealt with huge waves of either refugees or displacement. And it's pretty incredible, if you want to look at it in a positive light, how well this country has functioned. I mean, so when one talks about the absolute dysfunction of the state, that's true. When you look at to this day, there's no actual, like, imagine now there's still no real, I mean, I know somebody declared it, but there's no real national emergency plan to deal. There is, you know, bits and pieces here and there, but there's no real actual strategy that has been set up with the resources, and you know, it's sort of, each person is kind of going along. You know, they're going into public schools, they're doing things on the Corniche. So There's no real emergency plan. The state has no resources, no money. The army is kind of neither here nor there. The money for NGOs that existed before has all dried up. From what I can see, there's very little money that's being given to Western and other Arab NGOs. Very, very little. I mean, I don't see much money. I see there's a lot of money that has specifically, they've been told, do not put money into this kind of thing. So a lot of money's gone. No state, no emergency plan, no international support. You have a genocidal entity that's trying to stoke sectarian things. You have some that are politically willing to go along with that. You have Palestinian refugees, old Palestinian refugees. By the way, these camps have also been targeted and are now refugee displaced. Some horrific combination of the two. Some of these camps in the south have been emptied or being emptied. You have an entire population in the south that's being displaced. All of that in very dense cities with a very delicate sectarian setup, with a lot of intent to create wars and problems here. And still, with all of that, if you look around, if you come to Beirut, you come to these places, the conflict is minimal. Like, I'm actually shocked that there's not people at each other's throats 24/7 all the time, as I think it would be in many Western settings. I just can't imagine that a guy from the inner, some part of Chicago setting that you were living in the old days comes to the nice areas, and a bunch of them come, and everything's going to be fine and great. Imagine if 100,000 of them pick up and go into the, It's actually shocking to me how few incidents there are, and how little concrete attacks and things. Even with the Syrian refugees, there wasn't, despite a lot of the talk about Lebanese are racist. Of course they are, and of course there's chunks that are like that. But one can focus a little bit on the fact that all these plans have been in place for so long. All the displaced, the refugees, the sectarian delicate balance, the lack of state, lack of resources, and yet somehow things still muddle along. I think that's a pretty incredible thing. And I don't know, and that definitely is a psychological state.
It's huge what you're saying. It's actually really important. It's not, it's not like a manic, magical undoing of what we're actually seeing. It's a refocus on the structural issues that remain despite the Zionist entity's best attempts to erase that, just like we see in Palestine. The one thing that you're actually making me think about that's very important for all of us to think about, it's not about not naming the violence that we see. It's about also paying attention to what voices are amplified, like you're saying, Saree, like what are the voices that end up being amplified and who comes to represent Lebanon? And for us to really take that question seriously and say, what is this shoring up? That the voices that are the strongest, the loudest in Lebanon are, whether it's our fascist politicians or people who don't represent what you're saying, Karim. I really do think this is not us being Pollyannish or sort of turning away from the horrors. It actually is a refusal to succumb to the story that is told about Lebanon in the face of all these horrors, or Palestine, or any of this, because that's our grounding force, is to say, you're absolutely right. I had the same feeling, whether it's in Lebanon or Palestine, of like, how are people not worse to each other? And I think there's, the flip side of sort of having to circumnavigate all the failures and the deficiencies of state processes, build a certain type of stamina. Now, I think we can focus on the fact that it's an injustice to constantly task people with their own resilience. That's why I don't use that word resilience, right? Ever increasing levels of resilience. But the fact of the matter remains that people insist on life and life making, despite the violence that's imposed upon them. And I think that's part of what we're seeing. And for us to, every time we see a fascistic voice, or a voice like Ussama, you were saying, that these ones that sort of break our hearts, is to be like, why is this voice louder? Why is this voice being pumped into my ears at a larger, and sort of more intense rate than all the things on the ground that Karim's laying out for us?
You're absolutely right, Lara. And Karim, your point is really well taken, because I think it's not just that those voices, Lara, that you're talking about are pumped in and elevated. It's also that they are like fundamentally dumb and stupid and one-dimensional, and in the most extraordinary way, and ignorant. as well as being everything else that we've discussed. But Karim, I think the point Karim is making about well, you can call it resilience, you can call it, we not use the term, but we do come from there is something very profound going on. And when Trump says he wants to destroy an entire civilization, we're talking, of course, he's talking about Iran specifically, but we're talking about the Middle East more broadly. And one of the hallmarks of the Middle East, as everyone should know, is that we do have a profound culture of coexistence. And it is deep and it is profound. And I think that helps to explain so much of how people cope in the face of this extraordinary adversity. And that's the irony and the perversity of what we are being confronted with, both in terms of Palestine itself, what the project there is, very clearly a project of ethno-religious nationalist supremacy, and then backed by the United States, which has no business being in the Middle East. So the idea of what is at stake now is not just the present, but also obviously the future, and of course a reading of the past, because it's really about how do we understand ourselves in relationship to what is happening. And at least we have some cultural sort of history. We have some culture. We have things that we can draw on to remind ourselves that in the end there is this profound history. There is an ecumenical sort of culture and a history and an identity to this part of the world that has been attacked mercilessly and savagely and repeatedly in our lifetimes, time and again. And the most dangerous thing is when people in our part of the world start accepting these ideas about us.
If I could just chip in, I think what Karim said is also, I agree, it's also profoundly important, and it's true, it's easy to lose sight of in all the horror, but I remember again, very early on, it must have been when did the Israelis, when they first started bombing the Dahi, like in 2023, and I remember there was a delegation of, I think it was women specifically from Ashrafi, who went, in other words from the Christian part of Beirut, who went to the Dahi, the Shia part of Beirut, and they took with them food, and they just and there was this, it was a beautiful scene of kind of mutual affirmation, like we're here to support you. And I think it's true that one does see that, and it's true that we who grew up essentially in Lebanon without a state, we forget we forget what that means. I remember during our war, I think it was 1977 or 78 or something like that. I remember there was a blackout in New York City. You guys are too young to remember this, but I remember it distinctly. And I think 10 hours, New York City didn't have the whole place was black. Like there was no electricity at all. And it was like something Hobbesian basically happened. It was incredible. And of course, by then we hadn't had electricity for 2 years or whatever. And we still don't have electricity from the state, as you know. We function without a state. And it's true, as Karim is saying, if you take the state away, but we saw that here in LA and other places, not just in the 90s, but in the 2000s too. The absence of the state, this place will go Hobbesian very, very, very quickly in the worst possible way. Whereas there's something about the lack of a state maybe helps actually pull people together in ways, not to ignore the nastiness that's also there, but just to affirm what Karim was saying too. I think it's very important for us not to lose sight of that sense of solidarity. One last thing about the state, when you see settlers in Palestine running for cover, you hear the concept of the air raid siren. We all grew up in the war. I remember when I was in school back before the war began, I remember every Wednesday at 12 or whatever, the Zamur al-Khata would go off and you hear it. It sounded terrifying to me. But then when the war actually happened, we didn't hear the air raids. The state basically didn't provide anything for anybody in Lebanon. It was like, everybody take care of yourselves. And people took care of themselves, but they also took care of each other. And I think that's something we should never lose sight of.
Yeah. No, I think this is so important. And there are ways in which there are communities that function in the United States, have always functioned in the United States like that. Like we can think about the anti-ICE communal response, and which has been ongoing for ages, or Black folks sort of realizing that they live outside the realm of state protection. And so what does that mean when you live outside of that? And what do you have to do to forge spaces of living and caring? And I think that's part of what we're saying. I feel like we have more stamina for that. Like this is what I remember. Actually, I moved to the United States. I had just turned 21, coming straight from AUB into the United States. And that is one thing that really kind of shocks you. And it's not to romanticize. I think all of us could probably have a response to people sort of, opening up their book with any book or something like that, with either their teta zatar or the fact that they don't have, they don't have electricity or having to turn on the hot water or whatever the case is. But I think there's something about building a certain stamina around what are configured as rights for everybody, that the global majority actually doesn't live with that, whether that's running water, clean water, electricity, which begs the question then again to come back to the structure. What's the structure that sets up a global condition in which a global majority doesn't live with the things that I think people of the global north just assume are part of their everyday life? And that does force or kind of make people have to forge different ways of functioning. There might be a shadow structure of the state sort of happening, but it does do that. Actually, thinking, Saree, too, that you were saying about the sirens, that anytime we see Zionist meltdowns around them being bombed or whatever is such a confession, by the way, about how safe they have actually been, despite the fact that they peddle in the narrative that they've been the most, aggressed upon and they live in a sort of aggressive neighborhood. It actually shows exactly what Karim was saying, what all of you have been saying, is that to the contrary, number one, it shows us who the real intruder is. And I think that's something for us to focus on. Right? When you talk about Iran as an intruder to our region, that's just not only a historical, but completely a psychic inversion about who the actual intruder in the region is. But the level of lack of stamina for anything, when you do have the sirens, when you do have the bomb shelters, we're like, all of us don't, and not the least of which also is that it occurred to me very early on in 2023. Like, I grew up in and out of a bomb shelter the first 5 years of my life, right? But the bomb shelter actually had a function then. Now you have the United States and the state now known as Israel dropping bombs that make bomb shelters obsolete. There's no reason. The bomb shelter doesn't do what it's supposed to do.
On the contrary, you're actually worse off at a bomb shelter when they drop those 2,000-pound bombs on you.
Exactly. So just, I guess all of this is just making me, again, a regrounding, number one in the structure, number one in the psychic conversions that we're being pulled into, a reconfiguration about what it means actually to have built up the stamina to live without a state structure, and some of the ways in which that actually can help us forge new possibilities because we don't know what's to come. So I'm really appreciative to all of you for kind of, we're contending with really heavy realities, but there's so much here also for us to focus on. That's not just, it's not I've said this before. I think I said this to Ussama when we were met up in real time. It's just like the history hasn't been written yet. And it's really something for us not to, write a history that hasn't happened yet. I think there's something really important about that. But as we sort of start to wind down, any final thoughts that you all have or want to?
Well, I had a question just in terms of maybe Laura as the expert amongst us here. How much of this is also in layman's terms, in our terms, in my terms at least, how much of this is also the inability, people recognize the evil around them in the Middle East? I mean, the very few people actually support, for example, the Zionist project that I'm aware of. I'm talking about the Arabs and Muslims. Very few actually support it in sort of when they think about it seriously. It's more that, is it a question that they recognize their own weakness and therefore they start kicking, it's not about, as Sadie was saying, locating yourselves in a racial hierarchy, but it's also the idea of, we can't do this, therefore we scapegoat here. We turn all our ire on those who remind us that we are in fact weak. We are in fact defeated and crushed, and we've accepted our defeat.
Who are you referring to, Ussama? Who are you referring to?
People who, like, for example, turn on the ire in Lebanon, for example, against the Shia, saying you can't do anything about this, therefore don't do this. And you're saying, you see what I'm saying? Or the ire against other people in the region, against Palestinians when they're displaced. I'm trying to figure out how do we make sense of that? Is that a form of scapegoating? Is that a sense of recognition of something and a displacement of some sort? I don't know.
Karim, did you want to say?
No. You're the, as someone said, you're the expert here.
I don't know about that.
I just would push back on the question itself. I think if you suspend the idea, unfortunately, of the heads of states and the kind of those around them, and as you know, and as we know, and as we know from the public polls, and as we know from our personal kind of life, most people are perfectly supportive, let's say, certainly of Gaza and Palestinians in general. And even in Lebanon,
most people are not. I'm saying most people are not, of course, Zionists. I'm saying I'm agreeing with you, but those who for example, I don't want to name
but that's material
names.
interest. Then you got material interest, and you have this interest, and you have among certain sections at the very top. Yeah, of course. Then there's the racial hierarchy thing where you need to show that you're part of them and not part of them. But that's, I think, at a thin level that unfortunately happens to control all the decision-making apparatuses in the region. I think that's the issue. I'm saying it's the reverse. I'm saying in the country.
Maybe I'm confusing issues. I just don't think. I think there's two separate sets of issues. There's the one of the anti-Shia discourse in Lebanon, which I don't think is just a thin layer at the top. I don't agree with you at all. At the same time, I think on terms of the scapegoating of Palestinians.
No, you're talking about Zionists. So just to be clear, we're talking about the Zionists in the sense of the thin. In terms of those who are Zionist or those who are against Palestinians.
But I guess I wasn't being clear. So let me restate, and maybe it's not even worth pursuing this line of thing. It's more that, given the as you said, there's an anti-Shia discourse in Lebanon, and it has its own layers and all that stuff. Then you have the anti-Palestinian discourse in terms of the scapegoating of Palestinians for all the ills of the Arab world in Egypt and other places, the UAE and other places. And Lebanon, of course, and Syria and other places now. You have that. And so how much of that is it's not about embracing, I'm trying to understand how much of that is, it's not about actually embracing, saying we're Zionists, as much as saying that, we resent the fact that you are, whether the Shia in Lebanon, whether the Palestinians, you remind us of precisely what it is that we're not able to actually of our weakness and of our. That's what I'm trying to figure out. So it's maybe it's a different set of questions.
If there's any state project, if there's any coherence of the state in Lebanon or elsewhere, that's the state project, is to cohere a target of displacement away from the necro-capitalist ruling class that are the real issues. So it's the constant distraction, but that's a portable logic we see everywhere, whether we can track this from Fanon is onwards in terms of psychological process. I think you're onto something, that it's less about Zionism and more about what are the other things that are being mobilized. But that is a larger, also I think, a larger political project that includes psychological processes, of course, of displacement, of scapegoating, of anything else. I always come back to the question of what is it a distraction from? What if people are sort of reoriented in this direction? The larger distraction is what? Is the structural issues that are actually at play, and who would actually have to answer to all of that? Is there, defunct political class that are the only ones who benefit from this? Kind of like what Saree was saying, is the Zionists are the ones who benefit from this. But yeah, there's a constant reworking of people's attention away from that.
I'll just add one last thing, which is that I'm trying to think through. It's more, and maybe it relates to what you first started talking about, Lara, but there is yes, you can talk about self-hatred, you can talk about this stuff, but there's also, and I think what's new here is, so the structural issues are structural, so they've always been there. What is new now in Lebanon, I think, or from what I'm feeling, let's put it this way, is the very, and they're trying to do it in Syria, and they've done it in different places, which is to push a very strong psychological or mental idea of defeat, fear and defeat. And I think Ben Gurion and these guys have been talking about that, right? You need to make the Arabs despondent. That's the only way that they can somehow. I don't know when that quote was, but that you need to have they need to feel.
In 1923, the Iron Wall.
Right. Right, that the Arabs just basically need to be defeated, and they need to feel despondent in their heads, and that's the way they get defeated. You're seeing this here. And this is playing out both by those that are not Zionist in any kind of real form, but are defeated mentally and just want to surrender. And it's also it's propping up some who are on the anti-Shia kind of racist, spectrum, and kind of pushing them to come out in stronger terms. This kind of the project of defeatism and surrender is, I think, the project that we're facing now. And that this war, ironically, the fact that Hezbollah, for example, in Lebanon, is putting up a much stiffer resistance than anybody, and I mean anybody, thought, including the Israelis, thought, that is, I think, changing the minds of people again. Because if they had been dealt with the way they were dealt with in the last war, I think the sense of defeatism among all the communities would have been very, very strong, as it was at the end of the last war. I mean, there was a very strong sense of defeatism. The assassination of Hassan Nasrallah was massive to everybody, certainly among the Shia, but even larger. I mean, he was part of people's lives, whether they liked him or didn't like him. So there was a sense of the end and a sense of defeat and a sense of almost near surrender. And this was supposed to be the final thing. And now that's coming back and saying, no, we're not defeated. And people are trying to push through the defeatist narrative. Some in the government and in the state are trying to push this in political terms. But so far that's being resisted. And so this is where we are, I think, in that sense now. We don't know where it's going to go. But the project of defeatism, I think, reached its peak in the last war. And by all rights should have now been gone even further, but it's not, because the resistance has not capitulated and is outperforming any expectation. And the Israelis are the ones who are now trying to backpedal and, oh, this is what we really want. Oh, we can't really take South Lebanon. Oh, this, oh, that. And the kind of constant threats. I think the threats are to keep the surrender narrative going in Lebanon, while trying to face with the realities on the ground that they're unable to advance in the way that they keep threatening they want to advance and keep talking about they want to turn Lebanon to Gaza and all this kind of thing. So, I don't know.
Saree, any final thoughts?
No, we'll give the last word to you.
Thank you all so much. And inshallah, we'll get to do it again. My heart feels full. You gave me a little piece of Lebanon, Karim, and it's always good to come together thank you for sharing space as brothers with me, allowing me to jockey with you. I really appreciate it. Folks, make sure you follow MakdisiStreet, catch up on the episodes. They're well worth it across the board. I so appreciate all the work you all do and the content you bring us. يعطيكم ألف عافية. شكرا.
Thank you, Lara. You too. يعطيك العافية.
Thank you, Lara.
Thank you.
See you soon.